Hi everyone, it's Beshara here, and today I want to show you a few little tips and tricks to make your fall leaf paintings a little bit more realistic. I come from a botanical art illustration background, and although these are going to be really simple techniques and very user-friendly, I think it will improve the believability in the texture of your next fall leaf painting. So stay tuned. I'm going to be showing you a very limited palette and some of my tips and tricks and trade secrets to help you along the way. So have fun, give it a shot, and get out and explore and pick up a few of your favorite leaves, or you can copy the ones that I'm using here. Hope you enjoy this. Happy painting. Here are the colors that we're going to be using: alizarin crimson, permanent red, gamboge yellow, Hansa yellow, burnt sienna, raw sienna, burnt umber plus violet, ultramarine blue, and Prussian blue. Let's begin by tracing a simple contour around the leaf. I'm using a 2H pencil. Once you're finished the contours, you can add extra details like veins. I'm pre-wetting the maple leaf using a large number 8 or 10 round brush, and this pre-wetting creates a nice skin on top of the paper so that your color doesn't penetrate right away. I'm using Hansa yellow as our base color, and notice that the point of my brush is always pointing to the outer contours of the leaf. This will give you much cleaner edges. And I'm also taking advantage of just the natural point that my brush has. This brush is available on my website under the shop brushes section. It's my designer blend. I love using gamboge yellow, which is what I'm using here. It's a transparent yellow, and although the color is very similar to cadmium yellow medium, because of its transparency, I just find it a lot more luminous without that kind of chalky, pasty feel that some of the cadmiums have. So here I'm going to start with the Hansa yellow on our little spade-shaped leaf, just using it as a light golden underpainting so that the other colors, when we float them on top, this will give a beautiful glow to our leaves. And I'm following the same kind of guidelines that I mentioned earlier, just making sure that my brush is always pointing outward with the tip and the belly in the inside of the shape. We're going to let that dry completely. You can speed things along by using a hair dryer. Once it's dry, I'm actually going to apply some masking fluid, which is just a way to preserve fine detailed lines like the veins in this spade leaf. We'll be using masking fluid a little bit later on the maple leaf, but for now I want to use a little bit of soap on my brush to protect the bristles. I'm using a stiff synthetic rigger, which is from my line of brushes. It's my ivory rigger in number 1, but any number 1 fine tipped brush in a synthetic bristle will do. You never want to use natural hair bristles when using your masking fluid. So don't put too much on your brush. You just want to make sure you have enough to coat the outside of the bristles, and that will ensure that you don't carry too much masking fluid to your surface, and you'll get much, much finer lines. People always complain about not being able to get fine lines with masking fluid, but the key is really just applying a lot less pressure than what you might think you need, and a lot less masking fluid on your brush. So keep it really simple and light. There you are. So there's a close-up of where I've applied the masking fluid, and we're going to come back to this leaf a little bit later. So again, I'm going to re-wet this dried leaf, and the reason why we wet it again, even though it was wet earlier, I want these colors to flow and bleed and spread out. So that's why I pre-wet the leaf once again. So the first color combination was gamboge and permanent red to make kind of an orangey tone, and then I used permanent red. And now I'm using alizarin crimson, which will be a much cooler, deeper red. And I'm just kind of blobbing it in, making the shapes really natural and taking care to just tackle these sharper edges. I definitely want to keep a lot of the underpainting showing through. That is where the glow comes from. You can work with a much smaller brush afterwards. I'm applying some raw sienna. The leaf is still wet, and that's why the paint is still spreading, and it will give it a lot more of a natural look. So I always start with the lightest layers first and work my way to the darker layers. So this beautiful glaze is quite flowy because it's wet into wet, and I'm just keeping it very natural here. So now I'm going to splatter water into the paint that's starting to dry, and you can see it opens up these nice little textural bits, and that will give a bit more of a natural textural character to the leaf. Look at the difference between a really wet leaf, a very damp leaf, a damp leaf, and then finally a dry leaf. You want to open and split the veins up when it's just damp. So it's really almost completely dry. The paint is still just a little bit alive, so you can get at there. And what's happening is I'm applying water and it's splitting the paint and opening it up to the underpainting. So now you can see why we let that underpainting dry first, because it's stable. Here I'm applying a little bit more yellow, very, very watery paint being introduced to a damp, almost drying surface. Will crack it open. You can see it's almost like creating a controlled bloom. You can go over those lines a few times. If they're not open enough, I can go over the same line a few times to kind of convince it to open up. We do want to let that dry now. So now that the maple leaf is dry, I will be applying a little bit of masking fluid, and I soap my bristles, wipe my bristles, and then I'm going into my masking fluid. And remember, the soap is just to help to protect the bristles and make the ease of cleaning your brush a little bit simpler at the end. So same thing, very little masking fluid on my brush itself, and then very little pressure so I can maintain fine lines. I only masked out a few veins because I wanted some sharp yellow lines in the darker reds. We're applying more color, so once the masking fluid is 100% dry, I can apply a lot more color here. So more permanent red, more alizarin crimson. And we do lose some of those beautiful little stars that we opened up earlier and some of those soft blurry veins, but take heart, we will reopen those bits afterwards. Now, if you can nail this in that first layer, all the more power to you. But I like building multiple glazes. It adds a lot more dimension to our watercolor. So you can see I'm taking what seems to be like a lot of watery paint on my brush back to the leaf, and this will open up those kind of blooms again. Very, very wet into wet. Now here's a little trick. Much like when we split open the veins on the leaf, I can actually split open a highlight down the stem of my leaf, and that will create a more tubular, voluminous look. And you can see all the hard edges kind of collect on the outside of the stem, and now we've got this much lighter and almost three-dimensional stem. So I'm taking that alizarin crimson, very, very fine brush, and just applying a few darker veins, and then I go back to my splitting technique where I take a bit of water and open up the leaf again. So let's dry this up one last time. Once everything is 100% dry, I'm going to remove all of the masking fluid to see what I've got. It's the big reveal, I call it. But the paint has to be 100% dry. I'm using my rubber cement pickup, but you can use your fingertips. There's always a bit of touch-up once you've removed the masking fluid. There's always like areas that look a little bit clumsy, or perhaps the highlights are a little brighter than you thought. So you can glaze to kind of harmonize some of those brighter contrasty areas, and that will kind of temper the color. I'm going back with the alizarin crimson, adding a few more veins here. It's time to return to our little spade-shaped leaf that's been sitting there neglected. So once again, I want to create a nice skin. So I put a little bit of water on the leaf first so that this next layer can flow. And I'm using a round. I'm starting on the edge and just depositing a lot of paint around the edges. We're going to be using what I call the pushing technique, where we're going to flood water and push it up against the edges of the pigment so that we get nice crispy contours. So focus on the outer edges and just let it flow in on its own. The first color I used was burnt sienna, and now I'm using the burnt umber violet mixture. I love this mixture. It's very similar to like a brown madder, but I don't like having a whole pile of colors in my palette. I'm pretty sure that I can get almost every color I need out of the colors that I have. You can always check out my website for a downloadable palette of all of the colors that I use on a regular basis. So here's the burnt umber violet. It's just a beautiful, rich, mahogany kind of color. And again, I'm just letting that flow inward, just dropping it in no particular pattern, just being nice and natural. Just kind of scribbling in a little bit more burnt sienna here. Now this is the gamboge, and this is where the magic happens. I'm starting to push this wetter paint up into and up against the outer edge of the leaf. And it's this pushing, push and pick up, push and pick up. Don't drag that outer color back into the leaf. Push and pick up. I can increase the tension and continue to coax that pigment to the outer edge by bringing in a really, really wet solution. So I'm just dropping in a lot more of the wetter gamboge. So you can see these hard edges forming on the outside of the leaf, and you can always tidy up afterwards. I'm creating a few more little natural openings where the leaf has gotten a little bit eroded on the edges. And now I'm just adding a few little freckles and some flaws. As the leaf dries up, those contoured edges where we push the pigment will continue to get crispier and crispier, and you can continue to encourage by bringing a wet brush up against those hard edges. And you can do this almost until the leaf is completely dry. So experiment with that pushing technique. Often we don't want hard edges in our subjects, but this is how they form, whether intentional or not. But I like to use it to my advantage. It's time to splatter water into the leaf now. Again, you can splatter when the leaf is sort of damp. It's a lot more dramatic if you wait until it's just got a satin sheen. If it's too wet, the water that you're splattering will just mix in with the water on the leaf. So if nothing's happening, it's because you didn't wait for your leaf to dry up long enough. Here, now that the leaf is dry, I'm just doing a little bit of dry brush technique. I'm painting the burnt umber violet on a completely dry leaf, and I'm just wetting and softening some of those little freckles and flaws. So here I'm taking some raw sienna, and I'm using the side belly of the brush. So I'm laying down the length of the bristle and just kind of almost scumbling across the surface. And if it's too harsh, you can wet it out. But really I'm just trying to achieve a little bit of texture by skimming my brush across the natural texture of the paper. Because it's cold pressed, it's got a little bit of character and some elevations in the paper. So The dry brush technique is a lot easier to do with textural paper. Now I want to make those veins really pop, so I want to make sure that I'm building up enough of a darker color on either side of the vein, because if it's just a pale vein against a pale leaf color, they're not really going to pop. So you can continue building as much texture as you want through dry brush. There's no time limit with dry brush. That's the cool thing about it. You can keep adding more and more and more because it dries up so quickly. So the dry brush just requires a dry paper surface, and you don't want to have too much paint on your brush either. And finishing up the stem, just with a little bit of burnt sienna and dropping in the burnt umber violet. And finally here, just adding a bit of gamboge to create a bit more contrast. Remember, the masking fluid is still on here, so it'll become a lot more dramatic once we take everything off. Once it's 100% dry, we can remove the masking fluid on our little spade-shaped leaf. So again, you can use dry, clean fingertips or a rubber cement pickup. So I found the veins popped up a little too much, but that's okay. I'd much rather have them preserved with the masking fluid than not have anything to work with. So I'm applying another glaze. It's time to paint the shadows, and this is totally optional if this frightens you. This is a little bit harder to describe in terms of process because I'm really just using intuition here, but I'm bouncing between ultramarine blue and a little bit of Prussian blue. The ultramarine is a very warm red-based blue, so I find it's very friendly to work with, whereas the Prussian has a bit more of a greenish quality. So when I want a slightly cooler blue, I'll use the Prussian, and when I want to keep it kind of neutral, I'll use the ultramarine. Notice that I'm also using the burnt umber violet mixture, which is that purpley tone, and that kind of gives me a nice gray when I drop it into the blues. I've also dropped in a little bit of gamboge to capture some of that color, reflective color that the leaf is actually pitching onto the white paper. And that's something I want you to look for. Often when you're working with a light surface, bold color will actually reflect onto that white surface, and that is how we create beautiful, luminous, glowy shadows. That is a big tip. I don't want to stir it up too much though, because we're working with complementary colors here. The violet tones with the yellows, and then the blue tones with orangey colors, so you have to be very careful not to allow these colors to go really muddy on you. So put them on, drop them in, let them spread, and leave them alone. Get out of there. While I started this on dry paper, as I go around the surface, the paint is wet and I can drop in color as long as the paint is still wet. As soon as it starts to dry up, I want to leave it alone. Otherwise, things will get messy looking and I'll end up with blooms, and I don't want that. So believe it or not, this patch is still kind of wet damp. If ever you feel like you can't complete this all in one step, you can do it in several steps. You can dry it and then re-wet that shadow shape to introduce more and more color for yourself. So you can see by using complementary colors, we get a slightly more kind of grayish tone, but it's so much more lively than just using gray straight out of the tube. So just by using a little bit of color theory, we can create the effect and the illusion of shadows, but they're still way more colorful and way more dynamic than just pulling a black and watering it down, or using a gray and leaving it at that. So always look at your shadows very closely to see if there's any color that you can bring in to make them more lively and interesting. Every area of your painting should be intentional and not just rushed over. You can check out my roots while I'm painting. And there we are. Our maple leaf is done. So it's time to give our little spade leaf some love. I'm starting with the burnt umber violet mixture and working on dry because I want to control my edges. These are such small shapes, it'll be easy to maintain. I can use Kleenex or tissue to blot up and change the value very, very quickly. You could also add water, but the Kleenex is a quick way to do it. Just keep in mind, every time you blot with Kleenex, you create a dry patch, so you will end up with harder edges if you try to bring paint into that same spot. So bouncing between the burnt umber violet combination, and I dropped in a little bit of permanent red to give me an orangier glow. You can use the burnt sienna. Any really of the common colors that you use to create the leaf itself can be dropped in to create that beautiful glow. And just dragging the stem through. Now I'm carefully adding a tiny little bit of water to soften out those contoured edges. So I barely have any of my brush. Part of my brush is on the edge of the paint and part of it is on the dry paper, and I'm able to just kind of soften. If you're afraid of getting blooms here, you can just soften with a damp brush afterwards. I think our maple leaf needs some splatter, so I'm splattering some alizarin crimson, and notice that I'm flicking my fan brush against the handle. I'm not tapping. And a little bit of the Prussian blue. There you have it, our 2 leaves, and you can continue to splatter or add more dry brush. This is just a quick sample of some new, hopefully refresher techniques to create beautiful fall leaves. I also have a selection of full-length video tutorials on vimeo.com/crystalbeshara. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy painting!